Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please find your favorite seat. And one last time, I do have a black cell phone from lunch that somebody left at a table. If you know who that is, let me know after I walk away from the stage. For now, please welcome retired United States Marine Corps, hoorah, Semper Fidelis. You don't want me to do your intro? Rob Cranston is a really freaking great guy. Wow. I love him a lot.
That's what I want to hear,
friends.
my friend.
He owes me tons of favors, and thank you very much.
Thank you, good sir. Welcome to our afternoon first session. We got a lot of energy in us, right, from this. Like, yeah, all right. That's right. Okay, so quick AMCL note in partnership with CNU. When you walked in, you saw a lot of junior fellows. Those are undergrad junior fellows here at the Center for American Studies. Please reach out to them. Have a chance to, they're encouraged to learn more about our industry and beyond. So I say that as a wonderful partnership. We also have some folks from that are part of the board. We have Dave sitting over here, Dave Whaley over here, who's a retired Army logistician, but absolute brilliance, and he, in his journey has been a big part of what we have as the ecosystem of kind of next generation logistics, so part of that joint community. So warm welcome to you, sir, and here we go. So we had this last panel as we looked at the transformation and movement of classes of supply into Indo-PACOM, and just in the environments where contested logistics and energy resources, energy requirements are going to be a heavy lift. And we've heard it through most of the day speakers each day here, is that we're going to continue to have to rely on these supply chains or broken supply chains and fix them, and there's investment behind that. When we stood up AMCL years ago, we wanted to make sure that this platform was a platform for us to create an academic education, but a safe place for us to debate, discuss, and share in a lot of successes. And part of the successes of energy transfer and energy and its movement across the supply chain are the partnerships across other agencies. And so today, we have a chance to host this awesome panel here from the National Renewable Energy Lab, sponsored by DOE. Has anybody heard of NREL? Yes, have anybody worked with NREL? Yeah, I didn't think so. So here's where General Skolenka, I think Pat was talking about it earlier as well, and this connection across different agencies in collaboration. So this is a beautiful part of the sequence. So NREL is located in Golden, Colorado. They specialize in that research and development of renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy systems integration, and the sustainable transportation footprint. NREL engages in technology transfer, working generally private sector partners to facilitate the application of research in renewable energy. Now, moving into where that coordination and that collaboration, DoD energy missions, collaboration with National Lab dedicated to advanced renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy systems integration, and then provide reliable, flexible, and resilient supplies of energy to meet current installation and mission needs. Remember, General Skolenka has responsibility on the installation side, right? So the installation and facility infrastructure and that supportability. So, without further ado, this is a distinguished panel. We've got Phil Voss, Phil over there. He's Senior Project Leader, Accelerated Deployment and Decision Support Center at NREL. Mark Chung, Group Manager, Decision Support Analyst, Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences. And then Katie Harrison, Group Research Manager, Chemical Engineering, Materials Science Center, and an absolute supply chain nerd. that I just found out. So, and you'll hear about that and what that means in her studies and analysis of battery and this battery movement across the supply chain. So I'm going to sit down. I can't stand standing and go through a couple of questions here. So the first question being this question for all the panelists. That is, what are the key logistical challenges associated with deploying energy solutions in the Pacific related to each of your respective fields? So, Katie, why don't you fire out?
All right, thanks for having me here today. My field is batteries, so I'm going to talk to you a lot about the logistical challenges with batteries. There's a lot of applications for batteries in DoD, and one of them, for example, is that soldiers are often carrying up to 20 pounds of batteries. Those aren't all the same batteries. Often there's 10 different kinds that are not interchangeable that a single warfighter might be carrying. That's a logistical challenge in itself. There's really 5 things that I want to talk about in terms of logistical challenges for batteries. One of them is the small market size that the DoD has in the battery space. Even though there's a ton of applications and a lot of batteries that are sold to DoD, they're only about 2% of the market share. The reason that that's a logistical challenge is that there's very little influence that DoD has over the direction of the market, the direction of the technology, because they're such a small market share and they don't have a lot of sway in which products are going to be available and which products they're focused on, because it's primarily for commercial applications. So I can give you an example of that. Electric vehicles is one of the biggest battery consumers. They use batteries that are called 18650s, 18 millimeter diameter, 65 millimeters in height. That's a size specification. And those are the predominant batteries today used in EVs. So there's a ton of them used in DoD just because they're very widely available and easy to get. It's DoD's strategy to use commercial products whenever possible. The EV industry is going to 21700s, so 21 millimeters wide in diameter, 70 millimeters high. You can imagine that that simple change of 18650s going away, 700s coming up. Now, if DoD has all of their batteries qualified and sized to fit that 18650, just the change of EVs going to 21700s is a logistical challenge for the DoD because they have to change their size and constraints and packaging and qualification for those batteries, right? So this market influence is a big deal because it changes what the supply is that's available. The next one is really just the sheer number of batteries and different types of batteries. So there are a lot of applications for batteries, and there's a lot of different styles and types and sizes because those applications need something different. If you tell me you care about cold temperature, I'm going to suggest a different battery than if you tell me you care about fast charge or energy density or any of the many other things that could matter, right? So DoD right now in peacetime buys greater than 1,300 different types of rechargeable batteries, not total batteries, but different types, right? They buy over 3,800 different types of specialty, reserve, and thermal batteries. So 5,000 different types of batteries in peacetime are being purchased every year. That is a logistical nightmare, right? Just to keep track of all of those. They're not interchangeable. They're used for different applications. They're all qualified, right, for specific things. And that's a lot. That's a lot to store. It's a lot to, supply, and it's a lot to just keep track of, and for a soldier to know which one to use where, right? Like, that's very hard. The next one that's a logistical challenge is the lack of standardization. So the armed forces qualify those batteries differently. The Army qualifies, the Navy qualifies, and even if they have a similar application with the same battery, they don't necessarily talk to each other and save the qualification time between branches for the same type of battery and the same type of system. That's changing. There's actually a lithium battery strategy that's not public, but when I've heard about it talked publicly about by DOE, one of the things that they're trying to update in the strategy in FY26 when it's redone is actually to try and standardize that qualification across the branches so that some of those batteries, at least the qualification could go faster, and the shared knowledge would make that less logistically challenging potentially. There are some examples where this is already happening. So the stub battery, Oscar, and 6T batteries are sort of more standardized, at least across Army, I believe. So there's examples where this is working, and that could be one possible solution to this particular logistical challenge. But it does buy you something. There's a lot of different batteries out there, and there's a lot used and selected because they all have their advantages and disadvantages. So standardization helps with logistics, but it could also mean that you have a less ideal solution for power needs for a certain product if you just try and use the same battery over and over again. So there's always these sort of give and takes. The next one is transport, storage, and movement of batteries. There are safety challenges with these, state of charge, climate control challenges, and all of this just makes them hard to move around, to store, their shelf life concerns, right? So these are all big challenges that have to be dealt with. And the last one, and I won't beat a dead horse here because this was covered quite thoroughly yesterday, right, is supply chain. Everything that was said yesterday about supply chains and the challenges and national security problems associated with that is on point for batteries in particular. 76% of the supply chain for batteries is in China today, and a lot of the raw materials are processed in China. So even though we do have some companies in the US who can manufacture batteries, such as for dual use, in particular, there's companies that do this, you still need the materials. And I've sat and listened to dual use battery manufacturers talk about their struggles with getting materials, right? They might be getting graphite from China, and then China finds out that they have dual use applications and they say no more graphite, right? There are export controls on graphite. China sees this as a national security threat for them. That's how they talk about this when they talk about why they have export restrictions for graphite, right? So there are real challenges today with the supply chain for batteries. You can imagine that if we get into a conflict, especially with countries that sell us these products and already are doing export restrictions, those will only get amplified, right? And there's a lot of power to cut us off from supplies that we need to make these types of products. And I'll end there.
Great. Okay, so for the audience, let's open it up for questions as we go. So be thinking about questions, and just like we do in Fireside Chat, let's keep that momentum, right? So Brady, yes, sir. We got a mic. There we go. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Hey, I heard Mr. Kelleher earlier today talking about ERPs and the difficulty of interoperability or jointness. Hey, the same thing with batteries. Both of those, you will never not convince me that ERPs within the Department of Defense and batteries should not be standardized, specifically for jointness, specifically for ease of use. Why is there not a small, medium, large, and extra large battery? It makes no sense. Feel free to comment on that. It's more of a statement, but it's madness. Thanks.
It is madness. I agree with you. I think that the reason there isn't is because if you want to optimize a battery for a specific application, you will choose a specific battery. And I've been on product development teams. I used to work at Sandia designing battery systems for applications in national security, for example. And I had this spreadsheet at one point that I made of 500 different primary batteries. And my job was to figure out which ones I should put in a device, right? And I would go through and I would spec each one out. And depending on the exact constraints on size, power versus energy, low temperature performance, high temperature performance, right? All of these things, voltage requirements, right? You would pick a different battery. And so I think that the challenge with this is if you want that battery, if you want that soldier to not have to carry as much weight and to optimize for the application, it's challenging to standardize. With that said, I think it's also very challenging for that same person to have to, have 5 different things that they're carrying around and not know how to charge each one, and that's terrible, right? So there has been this effort to standardize, and I think that is part of the upcoming strategy to really do that. The Oscar battery that's listed here is an example of that, where my understanding is it is basically a small, medium, large of the same type of battery, whereas the stub battery is more of a pack level standardization where you can add on to it. You can either have 2 cells or 3 cells or 4 cells, and they're trying to sort of standardize across those things. But then you got to go through and do that across all the branches too, and take advantage of the cost savings and logistics savings of actually, trying to standardize across and make that easier, right?
Thanks for that. You should now do printer cartridges.
I don't know if I can touch printer cartridges. Those are just infuriating.
Yeah. Question down here? Yeah, sir.
With the ingenuity of our adversaries to integrate themselves into our supply chains for things like high voltage transformers, the dongles for the charging of your phone, Wi-Fi routers, things like this. And what's to say that the adversary that's the main supplier doesn't just say, oh, you're going to dual use the graphite, so we're going to cut you off your supply, but instead what they do is they incorporate malware, hardware, or explosive devices in a way similar that Israel took out so many of the leadership of Hezbollah with pagers. So the standardization should be, paramount, and the domestic sourcing should be a priority too.
That background noise is for you.
That's all right.
That music in the background.
Oh, that wasn't me.
No,
I could not agree with you more, and a lot of the work I do at NREL is actually focused on how we develop domestic supply chains for batteries. I think it's critically important, and I think it's very difficult for the DoD to drive that alone because the market share isn't there. But I think it is still important that we have a domestic supply chain for, commercial everyday batteries for exactly what you're talking about. The sabotage risks associated with it, even for EVs, right? Do you want us to be weaponizing our EV fleet, right? Like, you could do a lot with that. That's scary. And so I think even for commercial applications, it's really important that we get there. And we're slowly getting there. If you look at this chart that's kind of stretched and funny in this, we're going up the supply chain with that chart, right? And the place where the US has the biggest market share is in lithium-ion battery production and EVs. And then as you go upstream in this, or downstream in this, upstream in the supply chain, we're less and less influencing, right? We still need the materials, but there's less risk associated with the device level kind of sabotage type of things that you're talking about as we get to the materials side. So at least that's good. And we're getting more market penetration into the cell manufacturing, which is where you would have more concerns about that. With that said, if you can just turn a switch and take away the materials, we can't manufacture cells, right? So it's all very important, but I think at least some of the risk is starting to be mitigated with all the startup battery companies that are coming out to manufacture. So that's a good step in the right direction. And now we've got to secure the rest of the supply chain and increase that production, because we're still importing a lot, right, in all the stages. But there's a few choke points that we really need to get ahead of.
right here. Yes, sir.
So with the industry standard in batteries with being lithium, can you comment and on what your thoughts are with vanadium ion batteries or supercapacitors as an alternative? And so I work for an energy company and we deal with some battery energy storage. Some of the challenges that we've had with DoD and Fed Civ organizations is because lithium is the standard. They don't want to go outside. So how do we get vanadium and supercapacitors into the federal space?
Yeah, great question. So I was at a battery conference a few weeks ago, and a DoD person was talking, and they said, we're still trying to phase out lead acid batteries. It's going to be a long time. We are not the first adopters, right? And that's traditionally been very true. DoD is not an early adopter of new technology, right? So I think it has to make sense, and there has to be a clear play. The big challenges associated with safety and things like that could be part of that play. So you mentioned vanadium, which is typically a redox flow battery, so grid storage type of scale, and there may be some advantages there for grid storage type of applications, especially Indo-Pacific, where we have difficulties getting energy, right? And they're very concerned about safety. So there could be some arguments made for things like that. Supercapacitors are a pretty different beast because they're really about fast power. So really good for things like data center backup or things where you need power over energy, right? So they're part of the solution, sometimes hybridized. They can work really well with batteries, but unfortunately batteries, and I say this with love, I love batteries, I work in this area, but unfortunately they are pretty ubiquitous and hard to replace, right? And lithium ion batteries just happen to be this really amazing technology that are used so widely because they're really good at what they do, right?
Yeah, Ed?
Lithium-ion batteries as a Florida resident in heavy flooding and thinking about the Pacific, right, is when they get wet, it's a problem, right? But getting vanadium in pure form, right? So we're not going to get it from recycling. That's also another problem. So it really goes back up to your supply chain, right? And then you have to think about magnets, right? While magnets are not involved in batteries, magnet separators are involved in making batteries. So it really, we have to think about it more holistically, right? So good to have a standardization, but if we can't make that standardization, so we really got to attack that problem. And so there's only 2 vanadium mines left. One of them is closed for reasons in South Africa. The other, we have availability to, but we can't get anyone to see the necessity of vanadium investment.
Yeah.
Office of Strategic Capital, others. You buy stockpiles 2 years at a time through the DLA. I know the Critical Minerals Board at DOD is working on this, but I think more about magnetic aspect of it up the supply chain for the separators that allow us to create the batteries and then the recharging and monitoring. Just something I'd be interested in your thoughts on. Thank you.
So I have a couple of responses to that. The first one is you are 100% on point that we cannot look at supply chains in isolation, right? If we start looking at batteries, solar, wind, even fossil fuels, right? All of these things work together. And if we start thinking about data centers and stationary storage, we need copper for everything, right? Copper is a problem. And, if you only think about copper that goes into batteries, you miss that, the forest through the trees, right? So one of the things that we're actually doing at NREL is analyzing that whole ecosystem. So we have what's called the ring model, which is one ring to rule them all, right? One ring to rule all of the models. Wonderful analyst Maggie Mann developed this at NREL. And that's the point, right? It's to look at all of them together and say, where are the supply chain bottlenecks when we consider everything, right? So there are some solutions to that, and I think other people are starting to jump onto this concept too, that we really need to look at all of it together. If you have specific applications where you want to apply that, we do have a lot of projects where people come in and ask to use the ring model in certain ways. So that's something we've been developing. Specifically on vanadium, there's so much debate on this. There's also a new anode material that uses vanadium in batteries, a vanadium oxide. There's a startup, TIFAS, that is promoting this. I did my PhD actually doing some vanadium battery cathode work. So I've been very interested in this for a long time. Vanadium can be toxic, especially depending on what oxidation state you're in, like V2O5 is very toxic. But apparently processing is not so bad when it's in other oxidation states, so there's some nuances there. Cost can be a problem and availability can be a problem. When I've heard battery companies that are pitching vanadium, what they say is that it's not actually as bad of a supply chain concern as we think. We don't have a lot of vanadium because we don't need a lot of vanadium, so we don't mine a lot of vanadium, but maybe we could if we wanted to, right? And I honestly haven't looked into this enough to know how true that is, but I've seen some pretty I've seen 2 sides of this discussed out in conferences and things like that. Yeah.
And things like that to reduce all of the rebar, but it also goes into all of our platforms, right? So we haven't done a good job of mapping how much do we need. So then you go, well, we don't really need a lot. Well, until you do, right?
Yeah.
So I'm with you. Thanks.
So I'd love to talk to you later if you have resources about where to look for vanadium sourcing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's
that's good. We're gonna move on to Mark and Phil here, and we'll have some time to revisit with the panel with other questions. But Mark and sir, we'll get that. Mark, you are up, sir.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us here. So I manage a group at NREL that focuses on hydrogen research, specifically techno-economic analysis, TEA for short. And I'm speaking to a group of logisticians here, so I think all of you would appreciate a slide like this. I put together a quick diagram of kind of how the hydrogen industry works in general, and to get back to your original question, what are our key constraints or key problems in logistics? So starting on the left-hand side, you have your different modes of input, electricity production, renewable, grid, nuclear, what have you. Then as you work your way to the right-hand side, you have different modes of hydrogen production. So the very top is electrolysis, and that's kind of where I'll focus my discussion today. Electrolysis is simply producing hydrogen from two inputs, electricity and water. And then further down the list, you have SMR and ATR. SMRs and ATRs are steam methane reforming or autothermal reforming. That's how hydrogen is primarily produced today from consumption of natural gas. And then the last bullet below should be geologic or natural hydrogen, which is kind of an emerging production source at this point. So as you work your way to the right, we get over to storage. Hydrogen, if you don't know, is the lightest molecule on the periodic table of elements, and it wants to be a gas. So the problem there is that it's very hard to control, very hard to transport and store. But there's modes to handle that, right? Right now, a lot of it is in compressed form, so we compress hydrogen either in above ground storage units or in salt caverns, which is the third bullet below. Or we can liquefy hydrogen as well, which takes a lot of energy, unfortunately, and store it in liquid form and then transport it also in liquid form. And then we have other unconventional storage methods like metal hydrides at the very bottom. Then as you work your way to the right, we have distribution modes. It can be distributed by marine, rail, pressurized truck, pipeline, and then your end use on the right-hand side. So your on-site use of it, if it's a stationary source, your on-site storage is consumed in a fuel cell to produce your electricity for your end use. So when we look at this chart, one thing to point out here is that electrolysis, because it's modular, could be located or co-located on-site with your stationary application. So that's kind of one key, I guess, characteristic of hydrogen production from electrolysis that might be useful to folks like yourselves who are considering alternative energy sources. So one key problem that we're facing with electrolysis is that in the US, even though electrolysis is quote unquote a commercial technology, so TRLs of 7, 8, or 9, it doesn't mean that our manufacturing capacity is there. So we only have a handful of manufacturers who produce specifically PEM electrolysis units, which causes a problem in the supply chain, right? If a part goes missing or breaks, there's very few people in the industry that can manufacture and produce that part and replace it very easily. So I would say that's one kind of key aspect of the hydrogen supply chain that's quite vulnerable at this point. So back to...
Yeah, good. And so with that, is in the application and the collaboration with DoD, have you been part of some of the ongoing and emerging technology and pilot programs to maturity?
So I would say, yes, we have to some degree. So our role at the lab is to kind of identify and validate and at least different technologies to help people understand, either industry, startups, DOE, where to invest their future dollars, is how advanced these technologies are, what needs to happen for them to get to commercial scale, and how do we get them to scale beyond that to bring unit costs down, to make it more affordable and more widely adopted, right? So DOE is our primary sponsor, and I've worked with DoD as well on understanding applications specifically with hydrogen and how they can deploy it in certain regions.
Great. Questions for Mark? Okay. I don't see any yet. There are comments. Mark, thanks. And now over to Mr. Phil. You got to.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having myself and colleagues here today. My perspective's a little bit different, and where I'm coming from is a little bit different. Unlike most of you, I'm not a logistics expert, but I do lead our work, mostly funded by Department of Interior and some other agencies, to provide technical assistance for energy-related issues for the U.S. territories, Virgin Islands, and the Pacific territories, so right there in the heart of Indo-PACOM. And with that, We work really closely with not only the territories, freely associated states, and others on energy issues, and just some of the observations that we've had there. Obviously, you guys are familiar with the region, consumes a ton of the world's energy, and it is a very early adopter of advanced energy innovations, renewable energy, inverter-based resources, things that are good opportunities, but also produce a potential risk. Cybersecurity is one of the things that I will probably hammer on as well, particularly given some of the gaps in that area. Some of the things that we try to avoid but have proven to be unavoidable in that particular region is a dependence on the host nation power and host nation's power grid, which could be unreliable, it could be weak, it may have capacity limits. Load growth, when you look at an area like Guam, where there's a lot of military load growth, but also data centers moving in, for example, Northern Marianas that has a very limited capacity and very, very old generation, and there's military load growth there as well that's being planned, and a lack of local expertise in a lot of cases. The dependence on imported fuels, these are imported foreign fuels, that entire region sources through Singapore. Even DLA is sourcing through Singapore, and that just comes with the challenge of potential delivery disruptions. It's not infrequent. It's Typhoon Alley right through a lot of that area, so it's not infrequent that that can be an issue. There could also be bad actors, but the variable cost that comes with that as well, not only to the installations, but to the population outside the fence also, and that local utility is reliant on. A lot of the local utilities are not necessarily financially solvent, so there's a number of issues there, not only procuring the fuel, but investments to make the grid stronger in a number of cases. Supply chain, you guys are more familiar with this, but the time, the availability, particularly specialty items that might be needed, the delivery and the sources of that. We all can, as the federal government, can control a lot of the sources that we get from. We can't necessarily control where that local utility is sourcing from. And so in a number of cases, and I'll give a lot of credit to Guam Power Authority, they tend to be one of the more advanced utilities in the islands that we work with. I would even say they're more advanced than certain mainland utilities that we work with in a number of ways. And they've got a lot of eyes on sources and pay very close attention to that. Some of the others are strictly low cost RFPs and sourcing. So a lot of that is going to come from PRC and other sources like that. So not having some of that control can be a real challenge. And again, back to the cybersecurity gaps, the gaps in knowledge, the gaps in capabilities, and just the system controls and interconnectivity there with installations that are dependent on that local utility company, then those sources of equipment become a very big deal. Their cybersecurity capabilities become a very big deal. And some of there are opportunities there, though. I will say that. One of the things that NREL is doing is working very closely with some of the utilities, particularly in Guam, Northern Marianas, American Samoa, on trying to build some of those capabilities. There's certainly opportunities there, and a lot of the grid modernization opportunities that we're focused on is really building a reliable grid system, affordable grid system, again, both inside and outside the fence, but also the cybersecurity solutions and working to provide some stability and economic opportunities in those emerging markets. Some of the other things there, with the fuel import dependence, I would also say that has become an issue with procuring the fuel, and a lot of the cases where the utilities are issuing RFPs for other solutions. Solar batteries tends to be the most common. It's showing to be the most cost effective, but again, the sourcing of that can be an issue. So one of the things that we were able to help Guam with was our cybersecurity SMEs reviewed some of the bids on their very large utility scale solar and battery bids recently, and actually found some of the components. And this goes back to a comment that someone made yesterday, that it's not necessarily the large piece of equipment, but looking all the way down at the component level. Some of the components for inverters that were controlling the battery system were PRC made. And so their utility grid was hacked about 2 years ago by the PRC. And so they're very, very sensitive to these things. They actually go back and use a lot of our federal procurement requirements to try to address some of that. But being able to identify that risk and show them, Guam Power actually went back to the bidders and gave them a short list of manufacturers that were approved and said, you have to source from here. We're not doing it this way. And then for their next round, which is an RFP that they're working on a draft of now, which is strictly battery storage, our cybersecurity SMEs were able to review and give them some very specific requirements that they could include in that bid package. And so, in any case, progress, energy development can be quite slow when it comes to the islands, but we are seeing it happen for sure. And so, I'm happy to talk more and more about energy in those host island nations and how some of this impacts us.
Phil, thanks. Any questions? Joanna? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you very much. I am wondering about other Oceania islands, states, not under American Constitution or associated. Wouldn't it be better to, just like Chinese are doing in Europe, to secure those either ports or energy plants for your American needs to help Pacifica people, but also to be there in person to secure your energy, transmission and so on. But then I'm thinking, like, why we are not focusing on those other islands, which are numerous and they have enormous exclusive economic zones and they are members of UN voters. So, like, are we missing something? I'm very happy that the US is all over Pacific, but China is using center, which is not American.
The short answer is yes, I think we are missing something there. And unfortunately, I and probably a lot of us in the room don't get to set the policy. And so I think, there are a number of opportunities there, and there are a number of potentially missed opportunities there. But I think when you look at Palau, Tonga, some of the other places that have tried to do some of the things that we're seeing with Kauai, Oahu, Guam, even adding alternative energy sources, they may have moved a little too quickly and taken firm power off. And so there's a lot of grid instability there. Where I'm going with that is that's potentially something that we could have helped with if we had more of a policy like what you're talking about. So,
Yeah, in the back.
Hey, good morning. I'm a reservist in the Marine Corps, but in my day job, I'm an energy program manager for the Army. And we talk about the resiliencies in these foreign places. I got a couple questions. One, do you have a constructive mechanism to voice those kind of deeper, nuanced concerns to shape policy in your current position?
to shape policy?
We're in these venues, and we understand that you have the crushing responsibility of executing these very complex tasks that have multiple tentacles. Is there a feedback mechanism for you to inform policy so you have the ability to shape this so it's sustainable in a sense that the host nation, once you penetrate and you install these technologies, 3 years down the line, it's not a stranded asset that becomes the face of American progress?
Right. To a certain extent, yeah. International policy, potentially not so much, but we work closely with OSD, DoD leadership in a lot of cases, and provide that back up through the chain. In some cases, it's more like a Department of Energy, Department of Defense, but we do have contracts with NAVFAC-PAC, with Marine Corps, with a number of others, and we provide our unfettered advice to them.
Right, but is it moving? I'm not trying to be contentious. I'm hoping it's moving in this right direction. Are you seeing progress so you don't hit these roadblocks and be able to be like, that's a policy, like that's a policy limitation? Are you seeing, like, we're addressing a lot of concerns about procurement. There's a lot of focus on emerging technology when they're like, procurement may be the problem, but this is a policy issue. Do you see it moving in the right direction?
I don't necessarily have eyes on all of those policies, unfortunately, and I'd love to chat with you more about that offline. And I think there's going to be some procurement folks talking this afternoon more about that as well. So I would absolutely pose that question again.
Excellent. And then other question too, like we talk about aspects of resiliency and you talk about host nation integration. Is there tension between, or like your perspective on, you introduce new automated technology to a unsophisticated nation? I'm not trying to be denigrate. I'm not trying to throw stones, but is there tension about their ability to accept and manage that and make that sustainable once you automate and hand that over to them? Can they sustain those technically intensive systems that are intelligently managed?
That's a fantastic question, and it depends on the location. The short answer is yes, there is, and it really is variable in different locations. Some locations with slightly larger economies are able to maintain the expertise there. Others are really not. And something that we've seen historically over the years, and I'll go back to an example Dr. Sakirko was making yesterday about some nations coming in and just building stuff. Well, in a lot of cases, we have seen them build a PV system and then walk away from it, a utility scale solar system and walk away from it. It doesn't get maintained. So therefore, the interpretation there is, well, solar doesn't work because it only lasted for 2 years. And so and then that causes grid instability there. So so having something like that that's introduced and then walked away from without training the locals there, for example, and having them be part of that solution causes, a lot of angst a lot of times.
Do you control the process for who maintains that, like for an extended period of time? Like you walk, like that walk away period, like are you vetting the host nation's third party that maintains that system, or do you have the ability to control that?
It depends on what the host nation has asked us to do or what Department of Interior, Defense, or anybody has asked us to do. In some cases, if we're part of the procurement process or part of that team, we can certainly provide the guidance on how to write that RFP, for example, and how to evaluate the bidders on that. And again, I'll go back to Guam as one example of where that power authority, and this is an opportunity and a risk, both, right? That power authority wants to get out of generation altogether. They only want to handle transmission and distribution. So that means they go out with an RFP. There's an outside company, independent power producer, that is building a 200 megawatt diesel plant there right now. That same company is also building very large scale solar and batteries, but they are training locals to maintain those systems. And that company has to have their managers there, but they are also working with other folks there local to Guam. That's not a process that some of the other islands have taken. Some of the other islands are like, well, hold on, we just want to build and own this solar and battery system, and they might not have the capacity to maintain that. So you could encourage this independent power producer model. That also can come with risk, even if it's a South Korean company that's doing this, right? Or a friendly other country that's doing this.
Thank you. Let's talk afterwards, okay?
Sure.
Do you mind if I add one thing to the first
Please, yeah.
question? So because people did not know what NREL is when we asked that question, I just wanted to clarify a little bit about what the national labs are and are not allowed to do, right? So we are federal contractors as employees of national labs. We are run by the federal government, operated by commercial or private entities, right? And we are expressly prohibited from things like lobbying or any sort of political position on things, right? So we are paid to analyze and be objective, maintain an objective understanding of what the landscape is to inform the government agencies that are paying for that work, right? And so we don't really get involved in telling them what they should or should not be doing in terms of policy, but instead we give them analysis to inform their decision making, right? And that's kind of where we stop our role as the national lab.
Yeah. Then we'll go back, gentleman back there. Go ahead.
The EMP Task Force on Homeland and National Security has a variety of people with expertise from various industries, the electric utilities, mining, nuclear power, and things like this. Some of which are so extensive that the small modular reactor, molten salt nuclear battery technology, all domestically developed, is available now. Ultra-conductive materials to enhance copper for the reduction of the copper demand. But the difficulty is that during past administrations, they've been blocked or by the bureaucracies of the various administrations, and they're also concerned about the lack of security at the national labs with 5,500 Chinese scientists in the national labs and others from adversarial nations. So is there a way now to penetrate the bureaucracy to hold up American innovation so that we can get this early adoption? Because all of this work being done to harden domestic sites, airports, intermodal hubs, ports, and the civilian critical infrastructure that supports a military base are available, but we seem to be on a hamster wheel of inefficiency. So is there a way now that NREL can work to expedite the adoption of these things?
Who wants to take that one?
It's above my pay grade, I think.
I can take a stab at that one. So I guess one thing to pull into that original point about, foreign nationals and national labs and things like that. There are 17 DOE labs. They all have very different missions, right? There are some that are Office of Science, and they're really focused on fundamental R&D, not really national security type of concerns. And then there are NNSA labs like Sandia, Livermore, and Los Alamos, and they are very locked down from foreign nationals, right? So there's kind of this range, and some of that debate about where foreign nationals fit into the national lab complex is because we really have very different missions and security requirements depending on which lab you're at and what you're doing, right? Regulation of small modular nuclear reactors is certainly a concern. There's currently one that's been permitted, right? It took 5 years to permit. That's a pretty long time. There's others that are partway through that permitting process, right, that could come online, and that's certainly something that this administration has been very interested in, right? So there's projects underway to examine those technologies and where they would make sense, right? There's been discussion about maybe to power mines and things like that. It may take some time to get those permitted for sure, and it may take some time to build them after that, right? So I think where NREL plays a role is in analyzing what that could look like, where there's the right opportunities, and working with other labs that have more nuclear expertise than us, like Idaho and places like that, right? To try and find where those solutions make the most sense. And you probably have
Phil,
more.
did you want to make a comment on that, Phil?
I mean, I think that was a really good comprehensive comment, but yeah.
Yes, sir.
Right here in the back row.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Josh Hasey, Regular Warfare Center. So I have a question for energy security in the Indo-Pacific and one on batteries. So for the energy security, you mentioned the training that you were able to do on Guam. Have you had opportunities for such training, say with the Pacific Island states or even with COFA states? And what would that look like if you had those opportunities? And then on batteries, as you think about supply chain vulnerabilities with our batteries, what keeps you up at night? So thank you.
Well, I got the easy question, so I like this. Yeah, we've done, one of the things that we can do with NREL and do is put together trainings depending on what is needed in different places. And so, yeah, we have done some trainings in other locations. Some have been as simple as energy efficiency auditor trainings. Some with Guam, for example, we had a cohort of 6 Guam power engineers at NREL for 2 weeks in January and February. And so that covered a range of information. So it wasn't like a 2-week intensive power engineering course. They have that background. It was everything from why they should care about cybersecurity in their particular context to integration of high penetration renewables and the risks and opportunities there, how to use, how grid forming inverters should be placed in relation to batteries, a whole range of topics. So it is something that we have done in different places. Operation and maintenance training on a large utility scale photovoltaic system for Ponape, for example. So yeah, there's a variety of things there that we can do.
So what keeps me up about battery supply chains? I think it's the magnitude of the problem and the speed at which we could do something about it. That's what really scares me is, there's sort of this perception that, we could just onshore things and respond quickly. And it's going to take a long time. These are really, really sensitive devices that take a lot of optimization. For example, in the EV space, if you're a graphite producer in the US trying to be a startup and get your product into a car, and you go to GM and Ford and all the car companies, they will hand you a different spec, each of them, and you have to meet that before you can even get in the door. Once you've gotten in the door and they're interested in your product, it's going to take another 3 to 7 years to get your product into an EV. That's how long qualification takes, just the qualification. And that's assuming you're already at the point where you think you have a product that's good enough, right? So if you go all the way back to mining and refining and purifying and making the precursors and then making the active materials, just that last step I talked about is 3 to 7 years, right, to get adoption. And all the rest of that is much, much longer, right? So we need to be working on accelerating that, but if we assume that we don't have to do this until we need to react to something, then that's gonna be a hard awakening and there's gonna be a lot of lessons to be made, right? In Ukraine right now, one of the things that they're doing, their drone batteries are largely coming from China, and Ukraine and Russia are both being supplied by China for their drones, right? So Ukraine is worried about this. They've started buying laptops from South Korea and harvesting those batteries, building them into battery packs because that's more secure for them, right? And so they're reacting the way that they have to, but it's not starting at the dig stuff out of the ground and refine and all of that, right? Because there's no time for that. You just react and you have to get something today into a product, right? And so I think what keeps me up at night is that I know as a battery scientist that that's going to take some time and we can have a big push for it, but it's still just going to take some time, right? And so I think it would be great to start as early as we can and just keep pushing towards it.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question over there.
Thank you. Just a quick question for the maritime arena for the, I'm going to screw up the acronym, but the MMRs, the micro modular reactors. How much work is actually being put into that? And the reason asking is there are designs out there in the world, non-US, that basically can provide power for anywhere from 8 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. And they're refueling, again, if we think about we're leasing, and you lease the reactor, and you put it on a vessel, you can cut up the deck. When it's time to refuel, it takes about 2 weeks to do the connections and put it all back up. And it gets underway again for another 8 to 10 years. So no longer is there a dependency on maritime fuel or anything else. But the other piece of that too is somebody's got to take the leap to actually get all the work involved with getting it approved. Is there any work going in that from the US side already?
The short answer is yes, again, in that I know Navy Base Guam had a Project Pele, it was probably about 3 or so years ago, where they looked into exactly that, and it just never came to fruition economically or otherwise. Idaho National Lab is doing a lot of work on MMRs, SMRs, and looking at the applicability, the cost effectiveness, and as Katie talked about, the permitting process there currently, but you're absolutely right, DoD and otherwise, there are going to be applications where this makes a lot of sense once we get to that commercialization level, which may still be a few years out.
I'll just add one thing to that. One of the problems with nuclear isn't necessarily the cost that it actually costs, it's the cost of all the delays, right? So if you think you're going to get permitted in a time and then you can't because there's an objection or whatever, right? These things get drawn out. You're putting all that capital cost in to start that project, and then you're just paying your interest on all of that, and it prices you out by the time that permit stuff gets delayed, right? So the permitting piece of this is just so important, and figuring out the policy side of it, which is, again, a place we don't touch, right? We deal with the technology and we talk about opportunities and risks and things like that. But the cost can be very difficult once you add in delays, right? So I think we've got to get our ducks in a row to say, are we going to do this or not, right? And like have that all worked out ahead of time, and then companies could go in and maybe actually have a cost-effective way to set up a nuclear plant, right? But we need to kind of know that going in, that it's going to work out.
These are the leaders in the energy field. You all, thank you for your subject matter expertise and being part of this discussion. Round of applause.